Representative Esau.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I have a bill, it's 21 RS 0947, and the short title on it is Property Tax Relief Act. It's identical to a bill I introduced a year ago with some other folks and has one minor amendment to it, if anybody's interested in knowing the details.
Do you want to expand a little bit on the Tax Relief Act?
I can do that. It eliminates the Safe Senior and the Homestead Act, combines them into one, and adds a golden years component to it so that there is a sliding scale property tax refund. It's not a rebate. And it is means tested, so it's $50,000 or less the way it's written right now. It caps your property tax bill after age 65, so it doesn't continue to go up. The bill last year was $26.68. The one change is that we have made it so that you only count half your income if you're filing jointly. And so there's that one minor revision, but otherwise it was the same as House Bill 2668.
Thank you. Committee, any questions? Seeing none, is there any objection to the request? Seeing none, the request is approved. Thank you, Representative. Representative Long.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to request the introduction of RS 0653. This bill has to do with repealing the requirement that businesses prepay sales tax to the state. This bill would phase out prepaid sales tax over a period of 2 years.
Thank you. Committee, questions? Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is one of my favorite bills. Mike, I ran this bill a couple of years ago, and it was a lively discussion. I think part of the discussion, maybe you could reverse it and have everybody, including the interstate guys that come in from out of state and do sell them, just have everybody prepay sales tax. That'd probably make this committee's job a lot easier. We'd get plenty of revenue.
Any further questions, committee? Seeing none, is there any objection? Seeing none, the request is approved. Thank you, Representative. David?
Good afternoon, Chairman, members of the committee. David Sofer, Legislative Policy Director for the Department of Commerce. The bill I'd like to introduce is 21 RS 0684. What this bill would do is amend the research and development tax credit. It would do three things. Number one, the tax cuts that were passed by the legislature a little bit around a decade ago have this tax credit now where it's only eligible for C Corps. This would go back to the way it was before those tax cuts where the S Corps, LLCs, and other pass-through entities would now be eligible. On top of that, currently you could deduct 6.5% of your R&D cost in the tax credit. We'd like to up it to 10%. And then the third item is we'd like to allow the tax credit to be transferable.
Thank you. Committee, questions? Any objections? Seeing none, the request is approved. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any further bill introductions? Representative Gartner, are you sure? Okay. Thank you. That will conclude that item of business. We will move along to open up the hearing for House Bill 2142. And for an overview of 2142, I would look to the revisor's office, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 2142 would provide that the owner of a building with a business on its premise would be entitled to submit an application to the county for reimbursement of the property taxes for the period of time that the business was either shut down or limited as ordered by the county government. The reimbursement would be paid out of the county general fund, and the provisions of the bill would apply for tax year 2020 and thereafter. And with that, I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you. Committee, questions? Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple of questions. Number one, this only applies to businesses specifically shut down by county governments. It doesn't apply to businesses shut down by the state government.
That's correct.
Number two, it says in here that an application that is determined to be valid, who decides whether or not an application is valid, and if it's found to be invalid, does the requesting party have any appeal opportunities?
It would be an application to the county commissioners of the county. That's who the application would go to. If determined to be invalid, there's not explicitly a provision or appeal process. So
theoretically, the county commissioners could determine everything to be invalid.
conceivably, but I mean, if they would, but I would also open up to litigation, I would assume.
Representative Blex.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your presentation. Help me understand, when the county collects these taxes on businesses that may shut down, county and then reimburses them back to other areas, would all those funds come directly out of the county funds? On a business that shuts down, am I understanding that correctly?
I'm assuming you're referring to, the county collects, essentially the county collects the property taxes for multiple taxing jurisdictions.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. That would all, as the bill is written currently, the full amount would come out of the county's general fund. There would be no offset for the other taxing jurisdictions amount.
Okay, thank you for that.
Committee, further questions? Seeing none, thank you, Adam. Committee, I'd turn your attention to the fiscal note. Department of Revenue essentially says this has no fiscal effect on the state. On the second page, it says the Kansas Association of Counties indicates the county government retains only 30% of all property taxes collected in the state. So I would assume perhaps during their testimony, they could give perhaps a better estimate on what the fiscal impact would be to local government. With that, we will open up proponent testimony on House Bill 2142, and the first proponent I have is Representative Corbett.
I'm here to support House Bill 2142. When a business has been ordered to shut its doors or have its hours of operation or capacity reduced, affected property owner can make application get some of his taxes back. The thing that's most sad about this is when you get a call from a restaurant or somebody, county commissioners or whatever gave them maybe 2 days before the shutdown. They just had a delivery truck in and spent a couple of $1,000s for groceries. They're stuck. Their employees they have no time to work the numbers. I think that something has to be done. It lets the people who are locking the doors have a little skin in the game. And I'll finish with this. All businesses are essential. Customers determine that, not government. If government wants to run it, if they cut off their source of income, they should get their property back. But the other thing you don't realize is, just because your doors are locked or reduced or whatever, you're still paying your insurance, your utilities, and your rent. You still have expenses just going out of sight, and you've had your doors closed. So I'd ask for your support, and I stand for questions.
Committee, questions for Representative Corbett? Representative Wassinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is this. How about all the counties who had to close things because the state government said you had to? How are they going to delineate between the two?
Ask me that again.
The state told everyone they had to shut down. So when the state did that, does that qualify for this, or are you talking about if the county individually, and how do you decide who is the one that is responsible for that?
I think this one kind of pertains to the county. You got to realize after a certain date, county commissioners of every county kind of had their own determination how they wanted to do things, either more stringent or more open than the governor's suggestions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Does that also impact if a city within the county, perhaps the county did not implement a shutdown or close businesses, but if a city did, would this still apply, or since the county did not have the directive?
I think whoever collects your property tax should be the one to pay it back out.
Any further questions? Seeing none, thank you, Representative. Committee, we have on our list next Eric Stafford with the Kansas Chamber. I'm aware that he is in another committee right now, so we will not skip him, but push him back to when he can come in. So our next proponent, we have Scott Schneider, representing the Kansas Restaurant and Hospitality Association. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I'm Scott Schneider with Hinkle Law Firm, representing the Kansas Restaurant and Hospitality Association. I appreciate you having this hearing. This bill is a recommendation that came out of the Joint Economic Recovery Committee, which the restaurants spoke November 11th on this subject. We spoke August 12th on this subject, and it's something that we identified as a need as we evaluated all the different state laws that created cliffs that many of our members unfortunately fell over. The idea of what this bill's trying to accomplish comes squarely from our Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. In a case that, the Chevron case, it's the holding that a lot of the courts use. It said this: the Fifth Amendment is meant to bar government from forcing some people alone to bear public burdens which, in all fairness and justice, should be borne by the public as a whole. I say that knowing that the bill does have a few issues, and I appreciate my old friend Mike Papoon yesterday from Sedgwick County walking Sedgwick County through a few of their concerns, and I'd like to go over them if possible. I noticed three that I thought should be addressed. Should the bill be extended to the business licenses, not just the property owner? I think that's a fair question, and the bill probably should address that. The second one is, should this apply to other regulatory restrictions or just emergency orders? Local governments have a lot of police power that's justified and needed to keep an orderly society, and the intent of this bill, as I understand the word shutdown, should more clearly define what an emergency order closure was. And then finally, this is the piece that I'm going to ask you guys to wrestle with a little bit. Should this be prospective or should this be retrospective? I'm standing here supporting a bill that looks backwards. I know that causes a lot of consternation, but when we asked for some relief, been at this now for about a year, it was really slow to come. I think that the bill caught Sedgwick County a little bit off guard, but on the other hand, the Fifth Amendment was something that's been in place since 1791. This is not a new idea that we're up here asking for. Part of the challenge of testifying on this is I'm not asking you to be a court, even though we're in an old Supreme Court room, because there's plenty of attorneys, trust me, that are going to be pursuing this. There's one already has in Sedgwick County, and that's not what I'm asking you to do. I'm not asking you to pick a side. I'm not asking you to be a Republican or a Democrat, because the history of this issue, the jurisprudence of it taking, is really quite interesting in the sense that kind of the leading progressive jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes is credited with writing our modern jurisprudence on takings. He once said that property must not be taken without compensation, but with the help of a phrase, the police power, some property may be taken or destroyed for public use without paying for it if you do not take too much. And that's quite honestly the balancing test that the court uses. It's very subjective. What is too much? I'm here saying that a sixth of every restaurant is going to be out of business permanently across the country and in Kansas. In 1 month alone, we lost $325 million of revenue. If you were to extrapolate that out into Sedgwick County, they said it would cost them $2.5 million if they're assessed a 50% closure rate. Well, a little quick math, $325 million. There's 2.9 million people in the state. Sedgwick County has about 500,000 people, 17%. Well, that's $55 million alone in Sedgwick County that we lost. Our members have a hard time understanding the equities of what happened and how we're going to move forward. But I think as a state, we need to put some safeguards around this idea that we can go in and it's needed. We're not here arguing whether or not the county or the state has policing powers. We think they do. They have legitimate policing powers. But if they're going to exercise them, there needs to be a way to understand that compensation has to be given. The thing that I'd like to finish with is back to the challenge of how much is too much. Representative Corbett mentioned that, we had stranded costs too. I know that the cities and the counties say that, well, we're protecting we're providing fire, we're providing police, even if you're not there. Well, I think of that as a stranded cost that they have. Well, we had stranded costs. We couldn't get rid of our meat. We couldn't get rid of our beer. We couldn't get rid of anything. We sold it for pennies on the dollar to get over the month of March. We sold it to grocery stores who would buy it for pennies while people would walk past a closed restaurant and walk into a grocery store with no mask and stand in lines like it was just a normal thing to do. So we would ask you to weigh this. I know it needs some work, but we hope we can keep this conversation going and find a solution for this. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Committee questions? Representative Helgerson.
I want to do a hypothetical with you, and we'll use the restaurant as an example. It's on. Closer? Can you hear me now? No? Can you hear me now? There we go. That's a first. Use the example of a restaurant. Restaurant is told to close in Sedgwick County. They lose 95% of their business, but they continue doing 5% passing out food out the door and carry out. They're not set up for a carry out, but they still get some trickled business in. What kind of discount or property tax reduction should they have?
Well, according to this bill, it would be proportionate to the amount they got shut down. We worked through kind of what is social distancing, and kind of the common guess was, well, 50% capacity. I know in other states it was less than that. It still is less than that. We're a year into this, and it's Sedgwick County is now 75%. They went to a few days ago. So all I could tell you is it's a proportionate to the amount of capacity that they've lost,
Okay.
according to the order.
Thank you.
Representative Corbett.
I know you're here just representing the Restaurant Association, but you can think of the barber shops and all the other little mom and pop shops that were put under the hammer on this. And it's hard to explain to your constituents why the big box stores are booming and they may be losing their business. So whether it's the 5% worth of carry out or whatever, the whichever business it is, you still have 100% of all your expenses until you actually sell the business or whatever you got. But it's an ongoing talk for these guys. They're working hard to find the money to make these payments.
This is one of the interesting issues that I've been up here 25 years, I think. This is one of the interesting issues where literally the smallest of the small, who hire some of the most needy people, the most desperate people for work, are disproportionately impacted. When I say this isn't a Republican or a Democrat issue, the orders that came down this last year disproportionately hurt the small. And I'm very thankful that Alan Cobb over at the State Chamber, we talked about every day, they get, kind of harangued for being the big. But this is a unique issue, and I sure hope that as you move forward and try to solve this moving forward, that you can keep that in mind.
Representative Clayton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Schneider, thank you for being here today. Restaurants are very close to my heart. Without working in them, I would not have gone to college. So what I wanted to ask you, though, is what kind of savings will you be passing on to employees? My sister-in-law is a waitress, and she had a customer cough in her face because she asked him to wear a mask. They're working under hazardous situations. And so I know that these restaurants are hurting, but how is it going to go to our frontline workers, our bartenders, our waiters, our waitresses? They are where my chief concern lies.
Yeah, and I think that's a good question because we all try to operate within the CDC guidelines, whether it's face masks or shields or distance. We try to stay within those boundaries, but we're no different than the businesses that were allowed to stay open. We allowed hospitals to stay open. They had some of the highest rates in our communities, right? We allowed businesses to stay open. Their rates, their clusters were way more than restaurants ever could find. So the data did not track with what we did to the smallest business in the state. So I understand your concern, but we're doing our best. We would hope society has learned a little bit from this, but yeah.
I don't think they're ever going to learn, but thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Day.
Sorry, I don't want to jump in line. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This might be a question for you as well as for the business owners that are planning on speaking as well. But I was just wondering about the CARES Act funds for the PPP loans that were given to restaurants and continuing to go forward in the second stimulus bill. I did some research. I found that a lot of restaurants across Kansas did receive several $100,000s of dollars in relief, which went towards helping to pay their employees and keeping the lights on, so to speak, as best they could. And I just don't know how much relief that actually brought to them, and I'm grateful that there's another round of it that sounds like it's replenished the account. And I'm hopeful that those businesses will go forward and get that relief the way that they need. I'm a commercial property investor, and it impacted our bottom line. We got a movie theater that could not pay its bills. And I'm just wondering how, this kind of bill would impact that sort of, that would be a lot of property tax to the county if a movie theater suddenly said, I need a break on this. But like you said, could be deserving. They're not getting any business in there, right? So where do we draw the line? But also, I'm just wondering, that money did go to the restaurants. How much relief did that actually give to them, and was it helpful at all?
So that's PPP was a moving target all summer. So if you remember, we passed it, okay, good, there's some relief there. It's certain types of expenses that could be written off. Basically, you're moving money from this next year's taxes into this year and trying to create cash flow. But what the Treasury did was say, well, you can't do it twice. You can't write off the money now and next year. And so everybody was kind of conflicted with what value does it really have? It's money in my bank. It's right there, so that's some benefit. But was it really useful? Because you're just creating another cliff for me next year. It wasn't until the end of the year, the second CARES Act, that got solved. So for all summer and fall, these businesses, for all intents, were just frozen. They either They may have had it, but they were worried about spending it. So, but that did get solved at the end, and the CARES Act and the PPP money was helpful. But there was just so much indecision that people had to decide, do you pay your employees? Do you let them go? Do you pay your taxes? What do you do? How do you prioritize that? Nobody's ever gone through this. And so I know that's not a great answer, but yes, there was some benefit. No, it was not the perfect solution.
And I appreciate that it's a tough question to answer, just putting it out there kind of in that way. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. That spurs another question in my mind. Have we seen what other states are doing to remedy this situation, because it was nationwide? What are some other solutions that other states have done to try to make these businesses whole?
And that's a good question. The solutions are across the spectrum, quite honestly. But we're in touch. Adam Mills is our president, and he's in touch with his peers across all the states, quite regularly. A lot of states started this, back in the summer. They knew that they needed some relief on the property taxes, on the fines and the penalties, and the prepaid sales tax obligations that they just weren't going to be able to meet. So they were able to do it then. Well, we didn't meet until in January, so here we are. So there are a lot of states that are much further ahead of us than we are right now.
Right, and this bill seems to have a fairly limited scope because it just addresses the property taxes. As Representative Corbett had testified, there was insurance. There was so many more expenses that continued on because you just can't just stop paying your insurance. So I'm wondering do we need a solution to attack each one of these individual items, or do we need more of a comprehensive solution?
Well, that's a good question. I think I have talked with the Senate, and they are working on a income tax credit against property taxes paid during the emergency order also. There are several ideas floating around the business. A lot of them came from the Joint Economic Recovery Committee that we're just trying to get a hold of and keep moving. The reason property taxes is the first one that came to our mind is because it's kind of a meaningful number. It's a big number. On the insurance side, the Restaurant and Hospitality Association has a self-insured workers' comp fund. We deferred payments to our members who are in the fund. We gave away free memberships to anybody who wanted it so they could have access to our resources. We did a lot of those things that we never thought we'd have to do to survive.
Thank you. Representative Sanders.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Schneider. Are you totally confident that it was the counties and the 105 counties alone who mandated these shutdowns?
I chased 64 counties around all summer long, trying to help them think through what these shutdowns would mean to their counties and the restaurants in that county. I'm pretty certain that I'm familiar enough with where the
Let me phrase it another way. Did the state have any role in this?
The state initially did, and then we passed HB 2016 that gave that authority over the county. The county could leave the state order intact, or they could do their own. And many counties, even Sedgwick County, actually created a better order than what the state had, and we appreciate that. But that didn't mean that they still didn't take a piece of our property that they, at the same time, were charging us tax on. So
in your mind, the state should be in no way culpable for this?
if you want to extend it to the state, I'm game.
I think that's where, the tax credit that you mentioned, that would be a way for the companies and the businesses to claim that against the state and their tax liability. Representative Awerkamp.
Just quick rough numbers question there, Mr. Snyder. Costs to a restaurant, their overhead, however you want to analyze it, you have a rough guess on the percentage of their annual cost that goes to property taxes. It seems as though if the government shuts down a business, the property taxes is a very small number in relation to the harm caused to the business.
You're absolutely correct. It is a small number, but it's a piece that maybe we could find some stability in as we move forward. But, you know, we were up talking about alcohol, curbside sales, you know, for example. Well, that's not a huge number, but it's one of the only ideas that we had that would actually put $1 in somebody's pocket. You know, so this is kind of an inverse of that. How do you create some fairness in that one situation? And this is not a complete remedy by any stretch of the imagination. We're not going to be made whole until restaurants are fully open. The number is just too large as much as the revenue that we've lost.
Representative Potter.
Thank you, Chairman. I was curious with PPP because I actually spent quite a bit of time helping local restaurants in my county apply for PPP. And I'm looking actually at the spreadsheet right now. None of it covers property tax. It all cuts it down to salaries, health insurance, retirement benefits, rent, those types of things, but property tax is not covered. I didn't know if you had any restaurants that actually received any funding to help with that aspect.
No, we've kind of like you've said, we've encouraged everybody to stay well within the rules of the PPP program. It's not a perfect program, but it was better than nothing at the time. So there are these pieces, but keep in mind, PPP was just really available for 2 months initially. Well, we're at this thing now for about a year. I think we left mid-March last year from the legislative session, so 2 months versus the year is a complicated math piece if you own your own little business.
Thank you.
Representative Stogstill, did you have a question online?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a real interest in this because although my district is primarily residential, we do have 2 rather large upscale shopping centers within my district that house some of the best restaurants in the Kansas City metro. And we're very lucky to have those. The problem is that both those shopping centers are basically owned by large national corporations. And I'm not seeing how, unless you own your own building, how do we get that money back to these restaurateurs instead of just going to these, like the ones that own the shopping centers in my district? It looks like that property tax money would not only be going back to those developers, but out-of-state developers who pay those property taxes.
And I think that's a very legitimate point. It was the first thing that Mike Papoon, I think, addressed in the Sedgwick County meeting that we worked this bill that you probably should address is how does the benefit get back to the business? And the way that is to just property owners. So there has to be a way to do that.
Yeah, I'm all for helping the restaurateurs, but this certainly doesn't seem like the way to do it. The way it's written now, for sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Scott, that gets me to, reminded me of the question I wanted to ask, and basically is, what percentage of restaurants actually own their buildings?
That's a complicated question. I don't know.
I mean,
I have that answer. I know take a franchise, for example. McDonald's corporate owns all of their property. The local guy does not own it. So that's something that you'd want to know. But every business, every entity probably has a pretty unique arrangement.
I would just venture to say that majority lease, I would think, and hopefully if they did get a PPP loan, of course the property tax is incorporated in their, I'm sure, monthly payments some way somehow. But hopefully, if they did get PPP, they would get relief via payment of the rent and have it forgiven. Any comment on that, or?
Well, there's several ways to do that. Even if you own the building, you'd set up an entity and rent it back from yourself. But I can't say that I know everybody's situation in that. Keep in mind, even the PPP, that you could assign your lease obligation toward that expense. It wasn't for a full year.
Thank you.
Committee, any further questions? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
You took a majority of the questions there, so we appreciate that. Looks like Mr. Stafford has joined us, so we would like to welcome to committee Eric Stafford with the Kansas Chamber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members. Good afternoon. I'm sorry if I've missed my initial window or where we are on this process. We had another bill up in House Judiciary, and unfortunately haven't found a way to clone myself yet, but feel bad for the person if I do. We are here to speak in support of House Bill 2142 today. I think you can look in our written statement here, and the biggest key for us, or message that we'd like to get across, is that under existing law, under the Emergency Management Act, there is a right for businesses to compensation. There's a quote from a press release issued on December 31st from the Attorney General's office. This lawsuit raises important public policy questions extending well beyond this individual case. It would be better answered by the legislature rather than the courts. I agree with the basic principle reflected in current law that was not addressed, that the current law was not designed to address these sorts of business shutdown orders. So I think that we believe this is an important first step in the discussion of how do we address this going forward for the businesses that have been impacted throughout the pandemic, through ongoing restrictions. I know I've heard some comments and have received some questions from folks on this issue, and just heard Representative Gardner's question on PPP loans. I think that PPP loans should be considered completely independent from the statutory right that's in place today. Those were in place to be utilized for businesses to help their not have to lay off their employees. They were to help cover expenses associated with a business, and I don't think that we're discussing or really comparing apples to apples. So again, overall, this is an important discussion to have on what is the right path forward for the compensation component of the Emergency Management Act and what's taken place over the last 12 months. So happy to answer any questions at the appropriate time. I'm sure Scott probably took the majority of them, but I appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you. Committee questions? If not, I just have one. One of my fundamental issues with the way the bill is written right now, just trying to look forward into the future. I agree that these businesses have been severely impacted. Problem is, the way the bill is written, to bring that money out of the county general funds, where do counties get the money? It's not their money, it's taxpayer money. So are we, in a way, imposing a tax increase? Whether it's through sales tax or property tax, how are those counties are going to need to replenish that general fund should this bill pass 2 or 3 years down the road, even if they spread it out, that ultimately is going to get paid by the taxpayers.
And I think structurally there's ways we can look at how to accomplish that, whether it's property or income tax credits over time, or other ways to avoid a mass withdrawal from the county fund. Sorry, I kept thinking deposit, like that's not the word. Apologize. Yeah, so to avoid that situation where, you know, you're having to shell out a bunch of money from the local government standpoint, I think relatively sensitive to that. But I think it's, yeah, how do we, I think we're open to those ways to potentially modify it over the long term. So, yeah, to avoid that type of impact.
Thank you. Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for your testimony there, Eric. So this whole property tax thing, a lot of people don't realize those taxes are paid in arrears. You operate for a year, then you pay it. So the county commissioners, if you start changing that, you're really going to create some havoc there. I think the core problem here is we're going to have to look at that property tax issue going forward, because a lot of those businesses will never come back. And those county commissioners are really, really going to have a difficult time finding revenue to replace all that commercial property that's going dark. I was in Kansas City the other day, Metcalf Avenue with all those office buildings. Most of those offices are dark. And I'm sure they'll be up here to really talk about the dark store. So, yeah, I hear this, and I know we've certainly got to look at that. But boy, we're all challenged to find some good answers.
Yeah, absolutely. And same thing driving through Lawrence the other night when we were up there for dinner. Noticed just a lot of retail space is now vacant. It's a real issue, but I think that goes to show that there needs to be sensitivity to the private sector and what we offer, and that there is no guarantee for tax revenue. But asking those businesses to close, I mean, early on, everybody was on the same boat in March of what is this virus that we're dealing with. And we've had a year to learn what it is and collect data and adapt and learn. But expecting businesses that you're continuing to place restrictions on to bear their full tax burden is unfair. There's no other way to put it. So, yeah, appreciate your question.
Representative Corbett.
One comment I've heard a lot in business, there's a big difference between being in business, no customers come to see you, or being in business, they lock the door and they can't come and see you. And I think this, the main thing to remember here, if you don't lock them down or restrict them, there would be no problem. I mean, I've talked to people in my area where they regulate the hours, like you can only open your restaurant or your bar till 9 o'clock. They had to buy a special license to be open at midnight. So they jumped through all the hoops, they paid all the licenses, they paid all the fees, and never got a chance to play. So just a sad deal. I hope we get something worked out.
Yeah, and I'll say too, just for everybody in anticipation, I know we're working and have individuals on our behalf working on a fix as well. We're looking at business fees, we're looking at income taxes, we're looking at property taxes, but it's probably to the chairman's question, what structure should that function under? How do you give them a path without drawing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars from local government immediately? So it's trying to find that path forward. We're looking at it. We appreciate Scott and the Restaurant and Hospitality Association for bringing this forward. But yeah, legitimate points.
Committee, any further questions? Seeing none in the room and none online. Thank you, Mr. Stafford.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to welcome to committee John Arnold. He will be appearing virtually. John manages several restaurants in Wichita. Can you hear us, John?
I can. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Yes, my name is John Arnold, and I own and manage several restaurants here in Wichita. I'm here to support House Bill 2142, adjusting the property tax obligations when the government shuts us down, or at least help us with those difficult payments. The pandemic treated our industry different than most. So it was hard not to feel like that we were vilified. And, in places such as Lowe's and Home Depot, they were running more than 100% capacity. Um, you know, I can just tell you how I dealt with the pandemic myself. With my 4 restaurants, I own the property under some and I rent for some. The money that I paid to the landlords at the ones that I had to pay the common area maintenance, which included the property tax. So in the cases that I rented, we put the months that I was not paying rent onto the end of the contract, but I was responsible for the common area maintenance, which includes the property tax. And like I said, I can just speak for myself, but out of my restaurants, I was down right on track with national averages, about 34%. I was down $1.3 million in sales, and cash flow was down over $500,000. Another big part of losing that money was the loss of the staff. Once we put them off and put them on the PPP, it was amazing how many did not come back, that we had to hire new staff and then train them, which was a huge, a huge expense. And we also lost our head chef to COVID. We not only were down financially, we took a human toll, which was just devastating to us. So how I was able to pay my taxes was, because you have to pay those taxes or, you can't get your licenses. So I actually used money from the SBA. So I took out a loan to pay my taxes, and I will be paying on that loan for years and years and years to come with interest. So without the PPP money, I would not be in business at any of them. I was very thankful for what the government has been able to come up with. I do not envy the board here on these difficult decisions, but I'm just here to testify what my personal experience was, and that to piggyback on Mr. Schneider, that there are stipulations in the Constitution that address these very problems. So with that, I give it back to you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
John, thank you for your testimony. Committee, any questions? Representative Day.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you specifically, Mr. Arnold. You have several restaurants in the Wichita area, it looks like. And I took note of the PPP loans that you were able to receive for those restaurants, and I realized that they could not be used towards property tax. That is an understanding. But hopefully they were able to help pay for your employee salaries or the rent that was due, and that there would be some sort of offset. How long were your restaurants closed for, just from I think it was in April that they got shut down? I'm not sure how it was in Wichita.
Yeah, so I don't have the exact dates, but yes, we were ordered to shut down. I think we were down a couple of weeks, but then we went to just to go. The to go business, we were not in position in the marketplace to be viable in that market. We had a significant increase in to-go orders when it comes to the percentage of sales that we usually had in to-go, but those are still, minuscule in retrospect. And like Mr. Schneider was saying, we weren't prepared for that. The operating costs that go along with to-go orders was really substantial. So we ended up putting a lot of money into those to-go systems. And just to stay alive, to get any money going so that we could pay for our people that work for us.
Right. So, as I understand it, things like Grubhub and businesses like that do charge a significant fee for the use. And I know that there are conveniences that go along with that, but I certainly appreciate all that you guys have had to do to stay in business. And I'm sorry for the loss that you mentioned of one of your chefs. That's terrible. That's too bad.
Thank you.
This has been really rough for a lot of people, and that's not something anybody wants to hear. But thank you for all that you've done. Thank you for answering the questions. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Arnold, you said you were ordered to shut down. Who ordered you to shut down?
We were following the guidelines from the CDC, and the way that the pressure went, it went from Congress to the White House to the governor and then to the county commissioners. And I believe that the city of Wichita, the mayor ordered to shut down before the actual county commissioners did. I'm not saying that I remember that 100% correctly, but they had significant pressure from the county to mandate these shutdowns, and it went from 75% to 50% to 25%, and then complete shutdown, and then we came back up the exact same way we went down.
At any point, did somebody from Sedgwick County show up and say, "This is how it's going to be"?
Oh no, we just followed the website. The people that live in the community were very aware, and their concerns were warranted that we had deadly disease out there, and you wanted to stay in compliance at all times. So no one contacted me personally, but we were in junction with their websites, the city, and the county, the state, and the federal level.
Thank you.
Mr. Arnold, I had a question regarding, I believe you referred to some common operational costs that you went ahead and paid, and your property taxes were included in that. I don't know if you've reviewed the bill, would you make the application and would you receive the property tax money, or would that go to the landlord? And have you had any discussions, would that actually reduce your operational costs? I'm just trying to make sure that if this bill would pass, I want to make sure we get the money into the right hands.
Absolutely. Great question. We are definitely in communication with our landlords, and our landlords have, they've been over backwards to help us in every way that they can. Some of them giving us, free rent, some of them putting the rent on the back. They have really stepped up, but when they told us that, we're going to give you free rent, they made it very clear that we needed to pay the property tax. So we actually made checks to them for the taxes, and then they put the principal, or the actual amount that we rented the building off from, to the back. All of my leases are set up to where we pay for common area maintenance, which takes care of the insurance for the building and the parking lot, and then the property taxes. So those are actually two checks that we write to our landlords. So it would definitely behoove us all to make sure that there were stipulations in the bill that the landlords knew that the money was going to go to the actual business owner.
Thank you. Committee, any further questions? Seeing none, Mr. Arnold, thank you for your testimony. Our next proponent is Kevin Timmons, joining via WebEx. Kevin is the co-owner of Nick and Jake's Restaurants. Can you hear us, Kevin?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, make sure you speak as close into the microphone as you can. You're a little bit soft.
Okay. That's usually not a complaint of me, but I'll give it my best here. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Once again, my name is Kevin Timmons. I co-own Nick and Jake's Restaurants. I'm a former president of the Greater Kansas City Restaurant Association and am the chairman of the board of the association in the Kansas City area. And I'm here to support House Bill 2142. The legislature should adjust property tax obligations when government limits or ceases a restaurant operations. And I feel strongly about that. Every restaurant in Kansas was forced to make difficult decisions last year and will in the foreseeable future. Reduced revenues through lockdowns and restrictions have forced us to make choices that were previously unthinkable. Do we pay property taxes or do we pay payroll? Do we pay our property taxes or our vendors? Restaurants, along with others, are not fighting for pre-pandemic profits. Rather, we are fighting for the survival for our business. All of us have different rent structures, and the landlords and developers were willing to restructure or abate rent for a certain period of time last year. Few, however, were willing to simply just waive the missed or reduced rent payments. Those restructured agreements or added percentage installments that are due now and in the coming years. While revenues are still nowhere near pre-pandemic levels, restaurants are struggling to cover current and past due rents. Additionally, restaurants' ability to cover costs was hindered by food availability, inflated prices, and wasted products. In fact, Mr. Arnold could probably testify to the fact that the day we were asked to close was the day before St. Patrick's Day, and we were sitting, each one of our restaurants were sitting on between 800 and 1,200 pounds of cooked corned beef. That at that point was unusable. We even had beer that was spoiled, but in a quirky law, we couldn't even pour it down the drain due to its disruption to the wastewater system. And there's all kinds of examples that go on and on. Even with large-scale labor cutbacks and reorganization, the percentage cost of payroll and benefits grew exponentially. And then the simple controllable costs that we deal with on a daily basis, like paper, PPE, and packaging, were no longer controllable. They were out of our control. I'm proud to say that Nick and Jake's and a lot of restaurateurs in the Kansas City area had fought for every entree, every guest, and every dollar. We do not have year-end numbers yet, as the government has not released those statistics, but according to a recent national survey by the National Restaurant Association, 1 out of 6 restaurants, representing nearly 100,000, have experienced either permanent or long-term closures. Nearly 3 million restaurant employees are still out of work. The industry was on track to lose $240 billion sales through the end of 2020 and lost $165 billion in revenue from March through July alone. 60% of operators say their restaurants' total operational costs as a percentage of sales are higher than they were prior to the COVID-19 outbreak. We ask you to pass this legislation to give the industry, one of the state's largest employers, a chance to keep the doors open so we can continue to feed our communities. The restaurant community has not waited for government help, but has aggressively done the only thing we know how to do, and that is fight for our business. We're fighting here today. That was a prepared statement. I did want to quickly mention that there were some phenomenal questions to the previous speakers. And one of those questions was, what is the percentage of real estate or property taxes represent on our restaurant sales? We, at Nick and Jake's, actually closed one of our restaurants. So we had 4 restaurants open in the Kansas City area, and one of them just wasn't going to survive this pandemic, and we closed it about a month or 2 after we were asked to close. We reopened for to-go business, but then never reopened to the public. But for the other 3 restaurants, I did some calculations, and they're all very similar. The property taxes represents about 1.3% of our revenues for the year. That was prior to the pandemic. And now those property taxes represent between 1.8 and 2.2 of our revenues. So that was a question that really made me think, what is at stake here? And certainly prior to the pandemic, there wasn't as much at stake, but now it's, and we don't live on margins here. We don't have big margins, and 2% is certainly something to talk about. And then to finally mention, I'm glad John Arnold was on, and I'm glad he mentioned to-go business because he has similar restaurant structures as we do. First of all, we both John's restaurants and mine probably did typically 1 to 3% of our total sales as carryout. And now we're both experiencing between 25 and 30% carryout. And we're needing that carryout to survive. But both John's restaurants and ours, in kind of medium to upscale, full service restaurants, that food was designed to be eaten inside the four walls and to be served properly. And every single time we are serving hundreds of to-go boxes at one time, that fear of how is this food lasting? How is this food being controlled? How is it being controlled by a third party? And what is the absolute quality? And what is it doing to our brand as that guest? And unfortunately, it's not as good. And the problem is we've got a subjective concern that our brand is being affected. So as all of these things are being put in, we're just really fighting for every dollar, and that's why we're here. The Nick and Jake's restaurants, we pay rent. Both restaurants in Kansas pay rent, and we pay our property taxes directly to the state or to the county. And so I know exactly what those bills are, and if those bills were in any way reduced, we would see immediate help. I thank you for your time.
Thank you for your testimony. Committee questions? Representative Highland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today. I guess I need a little clarification on your last statement there. You're saying that on your rent, your property tax is a separate bill. Is that correct? So you're paying the property tax for that facility?
Well, that's the way we structured it with our landlord, is our real estate taxes come to us.
Is that a common among this industry?
Well, actually, the real estate taxes go to the landlord, and then the landlord twice a year happily drops them off on our front door. So we pay them directly, but we have not entered into a common area maintenance or a CAM lease with our two landlords.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Sanders.
Mr. Chairman, at the risk of sounding redundant, I also want to ask Mr. Timmons, when you shut down on March 17th, who ordered that?
Well, that's a good question. My understanding was that it was from the state, and that the state ordered a shutdown, and that the counties could either follow suit or not follow suit, and that's my understanding. Who specifically told us to shut down I probably don't know the answer to that, but fortunately, I was a part of a small team that helped in the writing of the reopening of the state of Kansas, and worked with Governor Kelly and her team. And upon the state deciding that those terms were fair, then the local county had to approve that as well, and not every county did. So I'm assuming that the state did the shutdown and the counties followed suit.
Thank you, Mr. Timmons.
Committee, further questions? Seeing none, let me check my computer. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
That does conclude our proponent section. Is there anyone that I have missed that wishes to appear as a proponent for House Bill 2142? Seeing none, we will move on to the opponent section of the testimony. And first opponent will be joining via WebEx. It is Jay Hall with the Kansas Association of Counties. Welcome to committee, Jay.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, and members of the committee. I am pleased to be able to come to you today. The first thing I want to say is to just make it clear to all of the committee members that we certainly empathize with what's going on with our restaurants and small business. Obviously, our county commissioners understand the impact that those businesses have on our local communities, and they understand that COVID-19 has been very hard on those businesses, and also very hard on the individual members of our community that own and work for those businesses. And we certainly understand the challenges that are presented to all of those businesses. Getting to House Bill 2142, though, KAC has 5 major issues with this bill, and I've pointed them out in my testimony, so I don't want to belabor all of those because you have that information in front of you. I do, however, want to highlight a couple of things that have come up in the discussion here today already, since you already have my testimony. And the first of that is there's been talk about some of the CARES funding. I want to point out a couple of things about CARES funding. First is that under the CARES Act, counties were not allowed to distribute any of that money in the form of tax refunds or for businesses to use for tax payments. And the reason for that was that counties were not allowed to basically pay themselves with that money. So one of the reasons that you don't see any relief being sent to local businesses under the CARES funding in the form of property tax refunds or rebates or anything like that is because that was not allowed under the law. So it was not something of counties deciding not to do that. It was simply that was not allowed under the law. The second thing I want to point out is that counties, while they were not allowed to grant refunds and rebates under the CARES Act, we did distribute about $57.8 million to small businesses and nonprofits through the Spark committee that distributed the CARES funds. And so counties have recognized that the trouble that was caused by COVID and by the subsequent business shutdowns, and recognized that those businesses needed help, and tried to distribute that money to those businesses to meet some of those needs. Understanding obviously that some of those harms were beyond the capability of the county to fulfill those, but nonetheless recognizing those needs. The second thing I want to point out is something that the chairman mentioned, and that's that if the counties are required to repay all of this money, counties only keep about 30% of property taxes. And so if a county is forced to repay all of this money to the through the Spark or through the county general fund, then the county has to draw that money that has already been distributed to cities and school districts and townships and water districts. Counties have to also pay that money back. And that's going to ultimately drive up taxes on our residential taxpayers, because the county is going to have to get that money from somewhere in order to meet the obligations under this bill. And the only place to get that money is going to be by getting it from the other taxpayers, and that is by and large going to be our residential taxpayers. I know that there's interest in exactly how much this would cost counties, and I don't have all of those numbers right now. I do have some information from Johnson County that says in Johnson County, they estimate that the impact could be as much as maybe $177 million, maybe more than that. We really don't know exactly how because of some of the questions we have with how this bill would be applied. But it could be somewhere in the neighborhood of $177 million or more in Johnson County. If we were to extrapolate that out across the state, we're talking about maybe somewhere on the lines of $500 million or more that we would be looking at. if we were to extrapolate that. But it's very difficult to say honestly because of the fact that there's really no clarity on how this bill would be enforced. And so I just want to make that clear. And then the final point is that because only building owners could make these applications, we're not sure how that would affect people that lease their buildings, because the bill just doesn't address that. But I'd be happy to answer any questions. Again, with the understanding that county commissioners and county staff understand what businesses are going through right now. But at the same time, we also understand that if the county is paying that money back, we're taking that from primarily our residential taxpayers. And I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Mr. Hall, committee questions? Chair recognizes Representative Blex.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your presentation. And this is kind of a maybe difficult to answer, but certainly I approached my county commissioners early on with the idea that, you know, hey, that May 10th property tax is going to come due, and can you set aside some of this spark funding for that relief? And obviously you've made it clear that that couldn't happen. But as director of the county association, do you know how much discussion was made on those businesses that were you knew was going to be shut down? I mean, they were mandatorily shut down as opposed to others. Was there any priority given amongst the counties in their discussion as far as allocation to those spark funding? As I look through a lot of the stuff that's going on, it looks like 75% of that spark funding went to either schools, hospitals, or nonprofits, people that are already on the tax roll and are getting tax money, and those people that's paying 25% commercial tax rate seem to get the short end of the stick. Could you address any of that? I know that's complicated.
Yeah, and part of that was because of the way that the Spark Fund was distributed. Counties received the entire disbursement, and then we're supposed to distribute that to the rest of the smaller taxing jurisdictions, so schools and cities and the like. And so because of that, counties first had the obligation to send that money out to our other local government jurisdictions like cities, so that they could distribute it within their city, and also to hospitals and school districts and all of those entities. And then from the rest of that money, the roughly 25% or so that was left, they were able to offer grants and other assistance as they saw appropriate within their communities to other entities within those communities. And counties took different approaches to that. And I think that's all broken down on the Spark website. I don't have the full breakdown in front of me right now, but I can get you more information about how that money was distributed if you have questions about it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Wassinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Hall, I have a question. Would you consider any other, I know that one amendment you would like to have is that it would just be the property owner, the payers of the property taxes that get the reimbursement. But are there any other things that you would suggest that might be amenable to the counties?
I think that, I'm sorry, I think the thing that I struggle most with this particular bill is the fact that all of the money is coming out of the county general fund. And Representative Wassinger, obviously, you've been a county commissioner, so you understand that taking that money out of the county general fund, that money is coming directly out of things like the sheriff's department budget. And I mean, that money is not money that's just laying in the back room behind the county commission chambers. That's money that's already being spent on all types of services that are out in the county. And as I referenced in my testimony, if that money comes out of the general fund, some hard choices are going to have to be made at the county level, not just on personnel type things, but also on, are we going to spend money on clearing the streets this winter, or are we going to spend money on maintaining the streets in the spring? Are we going to put more money into sheriff's patrols, or are we going to spend that money in the jails? Those types of choices would be the types of choices that would have to be made. And so I struggle with knowing how to make sure that counties can continue to provide their services while at the same time meeting the obligations under this bill, because I honestly don't know how counties would be able to pay all of that money out.
Representative Potter.
Thank you, Chairman. So I grew up in the restaurant industry, so it's one of those that's really close to my heart. And currently, one of our buildings is rented out to a restaurant. The property tax on it is roughly $9,900 a year, and they are 5 months behind in rent. So if something isn't done to relieve this issue, especially in local and smaller communities, the county is going to be out a lot more than just 1/12, 2/12, 3/12 of last year's property tax. So I'm looking at it as a long-term solution, because is there any amendment or suggestion you'd have on this bill that would make it more feasible for the counties to look at the long term and do a temporary relief from last year?
I think that the challenge is that, again, as I said, counties only keep about 30% of the overall tax revenue that comes from property tax. So when you only get 30 cents on the dollar and you're asked to pay back the whole dollar, that's a tremendous impact. I don't really know. I don't know many people that can do that kind of math and maintain liquidity if you're asked to pay back $1 for every 30 cents that you actually kept. That's almost impossible, and that would cripple the county from that perspective. And so that's what we're looking at. I know that there are some legal issues if you take that money out of the school budgets, because of some of the things that legally are required with schools. And so I don't have a great solution, but I do know that if you ask counties to pay back money that they never had, it's going to be exceptionally difficult for them to do so.
Representative Corbett.
You'd be more appeasable to this bill if it was just forward-thinking and not retroactive, so you could maybe take care of things before they happen next time?
I think we could. We also probably need to have in this bill some sort of limitation. One of my concerns with this bill is that if, for instance, a business is in violation of health and safety codes, like they're not keeping their restaurant clean, or they are in violation of use permits or things like that, they could simply request their property tax back. Because if the county were to shut them down, they could say, well, if you shut me down, I'm just going to ask for last month's property tax back. And I think I don't think that's the intent of this bill, but from my plain language reading of the bill, that is something that is possible under this bill.
Thank you.
Representative Arwell-Camp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hall, I think you brought up a good point there. A business that is clearly in violation of the law has done something wrong. County shuts them down. So what do you think about this bill having a clause that when a government shuts down a business or limits the business without due process, the government then has to compensate that business for the losses?
I think there is some concern with there are due process concerns, and I think we have those under the law. If you look at the Emergency Management Act, the actions that the counties have taken were legal under the Emergency Management Act. If perhaps the legislature wants to revisit some of those processes, and I think we had some of those discussions last summer during the TEMA Special Committee, and I think we've continued to have we have continued to have, I apologize, we have continued to have some of those discussions here during this legislative session, and the Kansas Association of Counties continues to stand ready to assist in those discussions and offer ideas and feedback as we continue to work on solutions for that. But the orders that were issued were orders that were issued under the Emergency Management Act and under the health laws, and they were issued in consideration of those laws and consistent with those laws.
Any further questions? Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hall, do you have any sense of who would be making the determination about whether or not a claim filed by a property tax owner was valid, and if it was found at the county level to be invalid, if the property owner would have any recourse?
This is a section of this particular bill that has given me great pause because there isn't anything laid out in the bill as to what is or is not a valid application. So that's a little bit confusing. I'm not sure how I would advise the counties to work through that. But the second thing is I'm not sure what an invalid application would be. And then I'm also not sure, I mean, it's not outlined in the statute or in the bill how any appeal would go or what the application would even look like. Those are things that obviously would have to be worked through. But there's really not anything in the language of the bill that tells us or gives us any hint as to what that would be.
Thank you.
Representative Mason.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hall, the KEMA statutes basically say that if a county commandeers a business during a disaster, then they have to compensate that business for that. Is there a similarity here? Do you see the similarity? It was the counties who shut these businesses down. Is that correct?
It was the county certainly that issued public health orders. And those health statutes, if you look at 65 I believe it's 129B, that was consistently the legislation under which the counties exercise their ability to close businesses in the interest of public health and issue orders consistent with that.
Do you think the counties understood the KEMA statute and knew that they would be liable for this?
Do I think that the counties understood the KEMA statute?
Yeah.
I believe they did understand it, but I don't believe that the KEMA statute expressly says that that a shutdown such as this constitutes a taking or a commandeering.
Committee, any further questions? Seeing none, Mr. Hall, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Our next opponent is Greg Mckinley, joining us via WebEx, Riley County Commissioner. Greg, can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for allowing me time. I've submitted a written testimony, which you all should have, and I hope you can read. I'm not going to read that whole thing for you. You can read that yourselves. But it seems like the basic validity of this bill would be if the property owner didn't get their value from their property tax. And that's not true. They still were receiving police and fire protection. The ambulances were still running. Roads and bridges were still maintained by the county. County paid for an election to be held, and our emergency management and health department were actually doing extra work. And the state made a few rules, but most of it delegated the COVID response to the counties. And counties and local governments tried to do what we felt was best based on other recommendations. If the state had rules, they didn't of how much they wanted us to restrict it. They're coming back a year later saying, well, you shouldn't have done this last year. We didn't want you to do it. The bill also says that the county, as has been mentioned before, that the county has to repay all of the property tax. And as others have mentioned, in Riley County, we actually only keep about 24% of the taxes collected. Say the rest goes to the cities, school boards, townships. Some of it goes back to the state of Kansas, and there's nothing in it for us to recap any of that money that went to the others. And as I said, if we have to pay that out, we've got to get the money back somewhere. That means the taxes will have to be raised next year or in the year after to make up for it. We don't have a pot of money. We're not like the federal government where we can just write out a bunch of checks and pretend we have the money. We have to actually have the money in the bank to send it out. And also, it just says if the business was restricted to whatever they say, 25%, just because they had less people there wasn't necessarily the restrictions. A lot of the public was self-restricting. A lot of people that were used to going out quit going out. They didn't want to go out to dinner. And so the county's restrictions weren't the only. Some of the reductions they received were because of people themselves saying they didn't want to go out to do that. And also, in talking about 25% only property taxes, is assuming that they were 100% occupied 100% of the day, which we know that's not true. They aren't. Parts of the day they are 100%, but they never did receive 100% capacity all day, every day. So there'd have to be some kind of adjustment. I don't know how that would be adjusted, but it just seems to be excessive, I guess, would be the word. That's what I had. Anybody has any questions?
Committee, any questions for the commissioner? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you. Our next opponent is Pete Meitzner, Commissioner from Sedgwick County. Welcome to committee, and I apologize if I mispronounced that last name.
Thank you. There we go. Thank you, Mr. Chair. You did get the name right. Appreciate it very much. You must have a little German in you. Anyway, thank you, committee, and welcome. Although it's nice to have a smile and a giggle, this pandemic last year has been incredibly difficult for all of you, for us. I was in business before I was elected to serve local public office, and I'm great friends with many restaurant owners in Wichita, including John Arnold, who talked. Him and John and I go back a ways, and I'll still be friends with him after this all is over and after I'm out of office. But that said, we did provide testimony. We were kind of asked to, what's the impact of Sedgwick County? And so we put together some information. I do have our CFO standing by in case there's some detailed questions, but I'll just highlight a couple of things in this current bill. It's been addressed that it does clearly say any business shut down. We had a case a few years ago before I was in office where there was an adult dance club, strip club, whatever you want to call it, dealing drugs and prostitution, everything else, and the sheriff closed it down. So if we're in this bill, any business is a little scary for Sedgwick County to consider. Another problem is retroactive. It's been discussed to December 31st of 2019 because of budget reasons, and we wouldn't be able to go back and raise taxes from the last year or a mill levy, but we would have to figure out a way to pay this back, and the only way we'd have to do that if we had to do it now to pay back last year would be to drastically cut services, has been referenced before. The impact in Sedgwick County, we did a quick estimate, and I think Mr. J. Hall talked about Johnson County. Our impact is at least 25 million to 50 million, and our general budget is our general fund budget's about 192 million. So, and then looking to the future, if we had to consider 50 million or so, or 1 mil is about 5 million. So we'd have to raise our taxes going forward about 10 mils under the way this is written. So there's a paragraph in there that kind of describes some of your commissioners, and you know that usually it's the sheriff's department takes the most. So if we had to execute on this, we did some quick math. Our biggest budget item is the sheriff's department. We got 550 sheriff's officers. There'd be about 140 of them would have to be cut out. And this is kind of across the board on other departments. We serve 911, got about 100 agents, so we'd have to reduce that about 25 agents of 911. So, and it kind of goes on and on. So, and then it's been just said before, but something that alarmed us was on the bill was reimbursing all the taxing entities, and you've heard that a number of times. Our Sedgwick County property tax assessment, depending on what group, what city, what township, it's anywhere from 25 to 30% is directly to the Sedgwick County Fund. You've heard that already. And then we've talked about a lot of the businesses affected. They did all the federal tax programs, the PPP and SBA. So you heard some of that. Of course, our businesses were involved in that. We understand that in Sedgwick County, there was 1,203 PPP loans, totaling about 563 million. I believe up in Johnson County, there's about 1,745 loans, totaling about 689 million. So the PPP, as much as flaws as it had, it still did serve. It served quite a bit. So you've talked about tax credits and things like that in the future. That might be a good solution. So we focused so much through this year. Sedgwick County had 99 million in CARES money. Johnson County had, 115 or so. And we all worked really hard to get that directly into Sedgwick County businesses, and it explains there. So based on the time restraints and the effort, at this time, the way this bill is presented, Sedgwick County respectfully would not be supportive of it in its current state. So with that, I'll gladly answer questions.
Thank you for your testimony. Committee questions? Representative Kessler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner. Just to save a little time here, how would you fix that?
Well, we've had some discussion about that. There might be some. I think the go forward is a good start, but that doesn't help. I understand the people that have been hurt. Some may be even permanently closed instead of just 2 hours a day closed. I mean, I don't know how we go back. There might be ways to go back over time to help repay. I think go forward as well. I think we need to engage the industries that you visited with. We engaged a lot with the restaurant and the bar business in Sedgwick County, and because we took the approach that the state, in June when that happened, the local health officer, we respected him. We've got a great medical community in Wichita, just like Kansas City has a fantastic medical community. And so our local health officer leaned heavily on the medical community, on the advice, and then in his health orders. We only deviated maybe once or twice from his order on a very small thing. But To answer your question, I would engage all the people that are directly affected by this and get the school districts to know that, hey, if this is going to happen, or if there was really going to be a penalty, maybe the reality is, Representative Corbett, you've asked, is that I'm not sure any county official would want to shut down any business thinking that they're going to, the tax revenue and all that's going to change. So maybe it's just more of a, it goes maybe full circle. It goes back to the state to say, this is what we're going to do, and we'll all figure it out together.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks for the question.
Representative Corbett.
You had a lot of good numbers that you were telling us, but do you have any idea how many businesses or employees or stores lost, but how much unemployment, or how big of a hit do you think that the small business or business in Wichita took with your decisions?
I don't have that in front of me. I know that our CFO did a quick review of all licensed businesses and tried to determine that. I can't tell you exactly. So I'm sorry.
My follow-up would be the county commissioners or city council, who determined what businesses in Sedgwick County were essential or not essential?
The state had that initial list of essential and non-essential. We worked closely with Johnson County. Johnson County did a great job of what they determined to be essential and non-essential, and we mirrored closely with that because Johnson County has their service industry. Wichita is a huge manufacturing industry and a product development, product producing industries environment. So we pretty much mirrored what Johnson County did on the essential and non-essential.
But the county commissioners probably had the authority to be a little more non-restrictive if they wanted to, didn't they?
That is correct. That was the way it was determined by, and again, I go back to the respect of the local health officer under the current rules where the local health officer has the jurisdiction.
Thank you.
Representative Blex.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Is the commission doing anything of discussion now that you know you have this dark cloud over your back as far as any tax credits or anything that might help alleviate the problem? You know, I first initially thought we're all in this together, and that's a crock because we're not all in it together. Those people that had their business shut down, they're not in it together. A lot of the people that was on a payroll and got a guaranteed check and kept on getting it paid, but we weren't all together. So I guess it would probably help us, it behoove me, if I knew there was some discussion by the county commission and even in my own counties that would do something to rectify this, not have to be forced to do what we're thinking about doing as far as a potential tax credit or whatever. Any thoughts on that line?
Yeah, an example that when we worked closely in our community, of course we have the CARES money and then the Spark. So we were making sure we were referencing our businesses. Hey, we can't do CARES because of the CARES restrictions with us, but Spark can do it. So we had a lot of that back and forth, and that was helpful. But one thing that was interesting is the band community, the stage community that were really just, they were shut down virtually on their own because there were not any concerts. Nobody was doing any concerts anymore. And and so we had a couple of locally owned venues that were dying and said, we need something. And under our CARES money, we could not do that. But we did guide him and them, and originally they got with the federal government to, it was a bill called Save the Stage, I think, something like that. And he told us what the minimum was he needed. He ended up, under the Save the Stage deal, he got all he needed, which was about 3 times of what his minimal request was. So my opinion is if we have, you know, I've talked to the restaurant industry a little bit, and I think they're trying to work there nationally, but if we keep working together on this next round of national stuff, recognize that where we're at, because I saw it happen with the Save the Stage locally. I think it could happen.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Helgerson.
Good afternoon, Representative.
It's nice talking with you, Mr. Commissioner. You and I had several conversations during this process. One of the concerns that's not been brought up is the rapid decisions made with limited opportunity for the private sector to react. I have some concerns about underwriting all of the costs to restaurants or other businesses because of that's just going to shift it in the future to homeowners and other businesses to pay for. But I do have a concern in that decisions are made without full foresight and conversations about what happens to the business. If businesses are given the opportunity 3 days, a week, 2 weeks, not to buy the, what was it, corned beef that we heard earlier, it allows them to save a lot of money. I can give you specific instances where city and county officials made decisions, and then within 1 or 2 days, the county health official reversed everything and cost businesses thousands and thousands of dollars. That kind, and I think everybody in my business is going to write it all off and just say, we got to figure out how to do it better in the future. But there is clearly a communication problem that county officials have with the health official and private business that I noticed. I noticed it in Sedgwick County, but I also noticed it throughout the state. And I pass that along because I think that that's something we can look forward to trying to do better at. And I'm sure you'll join with us in trying to do that in whatever we decide here.
Absolutely. I apologize. I think early on there was some fast reactions. I know that I myself, and we work very closely with our chamber and our major employers on whether it was Textron and Spirit. They're struggling with, do we buy thermometers and how many? I mean, it was, you all recall the early days of this was not fun. It was very reactionary. And I think we suffered from exactly what you talked about. But now there's a more disciplined and communicative approach, but it can always communicate better. And so I hear what you're saying, and it's good advice.
Committee, any further questions? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony, and thank you for traveling up to here today.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it. Thank you all for what you do, and this will be a challenging time, but I think we can get somewhere in the future here.
Committee, I'd also like to bring your attention to written testimony opponents, Charles McKinney, Clark County Commissioner, Dennis Kriesel, Kansas Association of Local Health Departments, Anthony Schwartzendruber, Harvey County Administrator, James Daly, County Commission Chairman of Barton County, Michael Smith, Leavenworth County Commissioner, Don Schroeder, Harvey County Commissioner, Stuart Little, Little Government Relations, Chelsea Schmidt with Morris County. Is there anyone else wishing to appear as an opponent on House Bill 2142? Seeing none, I will also draw the committee's attention to written-only testimony, neutral, from Sheriff Jeffrey Easter, Legislative Chair for the Kansas Sheriff's Association. Is there anyone wishing to appear neutral? Chair recognizes Trey Cocking, League of Municipalities.
Good afternoon, Chair. I thought I had submitted my testimony. I apologize. Trey Cocking, Deputy Director with the League of Kansas Municipalities. It's been a long day. The question in front of you is, how should businesses be made whole? Looking at this, we think there is a constitutional remedy under the Fifth Amendment. When there is a public taking, there is a vehicle available. We think that needs to be explored before this option needs to be explored. Because quite frankly, this option doesn't extinguish that option. We think the Fifth Amendment creates a place where a business can be looked at in whole. What did they receive through PPP? What did they receive directly from their county? What is the total amount of compensation that's been made available to them versus this, which just looks at one small piece, which does not get You know, is there a better comprehensive solution? Probably. Does it involve the state? Does it involve locals? Probably. This right here is not the solution. We are concerned. You know, I look at anything like this bill defunds the police, quite frankly, because they're going to have to cut the sheriff's department to fund this bill. I mean, that's where the money has to come from. It either comes from increased taxes or from cutting budgets. And, you know, when I look at city budgets, it's police and fire that have to be cut. And that's what a bill like this would do. You know, as Jay mentioned, there is no magic pot of money. I wish there was. It would make my life easier. It would make your lives easier. I do also want to draw your attention to this chart in my testimony. I'll make sure you guys get it. It's a chart from Kansas and South Dakota, looking at the restaurant and hospitality business. It was very well noted that South Dakota did not have any government shutdowns. When you look at this chart, you will see that the restaurant and hospitality business was off more in South Dakota than it was in Kansas. So yes, we sit here, we think government matters, but at the end of the day, it is not the government that is making these decisions. It is people voting with their footsteps. And when they don't feel safe, they're not going to the restaurants. Until we can make people safe, restaurants are not going to be full. It's not about a government mandate. It's about getting to a point of safety. And that's what South Dakota shows, where they did not have these government mandates. I'll stand for any questions.
Representative Corbett.
Thank you. One thing to remember on this bill, it's not restaurants only.
Everybody's available under the Fifth Amendment. If the government has impacted them, if there has been a public taking for the good of the all, they should potentially be compensated. And I think we need to figure out how to compensate these businesses.
One thing about this bill, I think that would be notable, that whatever the fix is, it doesn't happen again. And the government doesn't pick winners and losers. And it gives these people in Kansas a chance to work it out themselves. But just locking their doors and taking their taxes, that's not a win-win for anybody.
Committee, any further questions? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony, and I apologize. I'll make sure that if it did not get distributed, we'll have that out. Thank you, committee. That concludes our business for the day. I thank you for your patience. It is not my intent to go over our time, but I wanted to make sure that this bill had an ample opportunity to listen to all the conferees and also allow you the opportunity to ask questions. So thank you for your engagement.